Yes, this is a re-upload. Originally, I uploaded this in 3 different parts, and I don't know why I did that. It's been bothering me for 2 years. So now, I have taken all 3 parts and I've mashed them together into one video. Something I should have done from the get-go. I don't know why it took me this long to do this, but better late than never, I say. Enjoy. It's no secret that John Carpenter's Village of the Damned is regarded as one of his worst films. Rotten Tomatoes has a 31% rating from critics and an even lower score of 20% from audiences. I've heard all the complaints and I don't care. I still love it, shut up. And when I saw the documentary It Takes a Village from the Blu-ray release, I learned more about John's struggles with Universal, how they basically took the project over, cutting out important scenes. One thing haters claim the most about this film is how bad the writing is. And so I asked myself, was it really bad writing, or were just too many important scenes cut out? These questions sent me down a rabbit hole. Searching online brought me no answers. Finally, after a lot of hunting, I found these. The first draft of the script from 1993, and the second draft script from 1994. And I want to talk about it. Let's go! The first major difference is during the blackout. In both scripts, the blackout starts at 10 a.m., just like in the movie. However, the people don't actually start waking up until 4 a.m. the next morning. My hunch is it was just easier on production to alter this, but if I'm being honest, having the blackout be 18 hours later, plus the town waking up at nighttime, would have made the scene so much more eerie. There's also a scene cut where a TV news crew is on the scene of Frank's accident. This is presumably the role that Karen Kahn originally auditioned for, which obviously got cut. Thankfully, she landed the role of Barbara, Alan's wife. After the part where the police officer collapses on the road past the white line, oh no, a chopper flies overhead that belongs to the news crew, very similar to what happened in the original film when a plane flies over. Police on the ground are on the radio telling them to turn back and that they are entering restricted airspace. If they don't turn back, their license will be revoked. The pilot, disobeying orders, pushes forward. This story is ours. As you can imagine, the pilot blacks out and the chopper crashes in a huge explosion. Another difference is Susan Werner's name is actually Zerner, like Turner with a Z. But from here on, I'll be calling her Werner because Susan Zerner rolls right off the tongue, doesn't it? Another small thing to take note of is John Carpenter's cameo appearance, which was originally longer, and the scene originally takes place after Midwich is already blacked out. Credited as Bearded Man, he complains that the phone lines are down, and Harold, the gas station owner, snaps back, "What the hell am I supposed to do? Climb the pole and fix it?" Another major difference is during Frank's funeral, the cemetery takes place on a large bluff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, which will come into play later on. As everyone is leaving the service, Alan and Barbara make their way through a group of TV news crews, which Susan Werner confronts. She reports to the news crew that all deaths were indirect results of the blackout, and the tests that they've conducted haven't shown any environmental impact, and that the cause of the blackout was unknown at this time. Afterwards, there's a huge gathering at Jill's house, where her friends and family all gather to give her their condolences. Fast forward to 1 hour later, after everyone, except Callie, has left, Jill is sitting at a piano, mourning the loss of Frank and feeling alone as she starts playing a haunting melody, and confesses to Callie that she never said "I love you" to Frank before he left to go get helium that day. A few days later, she's out checking the mailbox, just like in the movie. Although when she stops, she looks over at Frank's woodshed, which the movie doesn't imply, and a deleted scene right after that shows her going to Frank's woodshed for the first time after he died, and slowly starts to cover up all of his tools. Frank's death was supposed to keep playing a major role in Jill's character, but we'll get to it. In both scripts, it's established that 20 women have become pregnant. In the movie, it's only 10. At the big town meeting, which in the scripts takes place at the school auditorium, Jill has a speech that's completely cut out of the film. She's explaining that she is also pregnant and that almost every woman in Midwich who's capable of bearing a child is pregnant. She explains that this meeting was not called to give answers, but rather to listen to information about decisions they have to make. The line, "Dr. Susan Werner has just flown in," which is heard in the movie, is actually cut off by Sarah, Reverend George's wife. She stands up, giving thanks to the Lord for blessing her with a child, and then suddenly stops and has a meltdown right there in front of everybody, and her husband escorts her out of the room. And there's also some additions to Susan's speech, stating that the monthly allowance is under regulations by the National Science Foundation, and that if any word of this were to leak out, the money stops. Afterwards, Alan and Susan are outside talking. She tells Alan that her only interest is research, and that he will run the clinic program and be listed as co-author author on all of the papers, Alan retaliates, congratulating her on buying them all off, and reminds her that what's happening here is literally ripping people's lives apart. He tells her that while her research is important, his first priority is the well-being of the mothers and the children. And in a scene similar to one from the original Wolf-Rilla film, Alan and Barbara are in the car on the way home after the meeting, and Alan asks her if she wants to keep it. In the second draft, she sits in silence and doesn't say anything, but in the first draft, Barbara turns to him and says, "Whose baby? Yours?" The dream all the women have in the first draft is much different than what we see in the film. They're all standing in a circle in a field, holding hands as the laughter of children echoes in the background. They all look down an anthill in the middle of their circle as a swarm of ants envelop a bird carcass, stripping it of feathers and picking it clean. Then at the same time, they all look up as something big and round eclipses the sun, and the rim of light starts flaring, burning our eyes with a hissing roar. Then they all of a sudden wake up from the dream. Personally, I like this idea for the dream sequence much better, but by the second draft script it had changed to the version we see in the film. Weeks later, there's a scene where Alan and Jill are in a doctor's office during one of her checkups. Alan informs her that she forgot to give her social security number for the stipend. She begins to tear up, saying the baby is Frank's, she isn't going to accept any money for it, and she's not going to allow them to study her child like some lab rat. Later on, Barbara is also in an exam room, and Susan tells both her and Alan that their baby looks perfectly formed, more than normal in fact, like a 7-month embryo after only 5 months. Afterwards, Susan shows Alan an ultrasound photo of Melanie Roberts' baby. She explains that it's their 8th try, but no matter what, the picture always turns out blurry, saying it's as if the sound waves don't penetrate and that they just kind of slide off, leaving both her and Alan confused. In late December, Jill is at home, which is decorated with a Christmas tree in the corner. She sits at a piano and plays the same haunting melody that she did after Frank's funeral. The same haunting melody continues to play over a montage we see in the film of her pregnancy. And this is also the melody found on March of the Children and Baptism from the film score album. When the children are born, there's a huge difference with the location. In the script, it takes place at an old army base, instead of the red barn like we see in the film. There's an old faded sign on the building with missing letters that says, "Home of the Peacekeepers." And as mentioned in the documentary on the Blu-ray, there's a deleted scene where all the infants stand up in their cribs in unison, looking out the window at the van where Susan brought the stillborn baby. 4 months later, after the christening, there's a scene where Jill is at home, once again playing the haunting melody on the piano. 4-month-old David stares at her curiously and watches her hands and fingers move over the piano keys as she plays. 3 months later is where David spells his name out in wooden blocks, and then 2 more months later there's a scene that's pretty much identical to the original film, the puzzle box with a piece of candy. Susan demonstrates the box to Lily first, and then brings Alan to the waiting room at the clinic, hands it to Julie, and she opens it right away. And just like in the original film, if you show something to one of them, they all know it, except in both drafts there's not a little brat trying to steal the box. In the second draft, Jill is there, and after Susan leaves, she remarks about how Susan only seems to look at these children like they're some kind of experiment. She informs Alan that she's stopping by Barbara's, and if there was a message he'd like to pass to her. Alan just tells her he'd be home at his usual time, and it cuts to the cringy boiling soup scene. The scene plays out just like the movie in the second draft. However, in the first draft, it's Alan who comes home and finds Barbara helplessly boiling her arm under her daughter's mind control. And in both of these scripts, Barbara's suicide scene doesn't exist. Now what does that mean? Does she survive in earlier drafts? I guess you'll just have to wait for part 2. I've let it be known on this channel that Village of the Damned from John Carpenter is a favorite of mine. I've ranted about how Universal took the project over, rushed it out to audiences, and in the process, butchering the hell out of it, cutting out important scenes.
And I'd like to know what they are.
And so I tracked these scripts down, and now I want to talk about it. The first part of this video is already out. Should be a little card thingy up here somewhere. And I left it on one big cliffhanger. Yeah, it's huge. Barbara's suicide scene isn't in any of these scripts. What does that mean? Does it mean Barbara survives in earlier scripts? It doesn't. She still dies from suicide. Suck at this. Let's continue. 6 years later, a title that was originally supposed to be put on screen is the scene where Susan is in the conference room at the National Security Agency, playing out just like in the film. One difference is, in the second draft, when Susan explains she hasn't gotten Alan back on the project, she is cut off by another scientist asking her, isn't he the one whose wife committed suicide? Are you sure this isn't getting? And Susan forcefully interrupts without acknowledging the question. And this is where things start to get a little bit screwy. The order in which events happen in the script don't quite match up to what's in the film, and I'll do my best to point these differences out. The first time we see the children in the film, they're all walking through the school playground, but in the script, that shot actually just bridges two pretty major scenes. The first one, the children are being taught by Callie, along with normal children in the classroom. The movie never establishes her as a teacher. Actually, by this point in the movie, she's forgotten about entirely. When fellow classmate Sally, one of the normal kids, doesn't know the answer to 6 plus 4, Julie impatiently answers 10, 10, 10, 10. Callie scolds her, and Julie and Isaac explain how incompetent Sally is. Callie then tells them to report to the principal's office, and once the children leave, Callie has a breakdown. And now is the point where we would see the children walking through the playground like in the film, which leads us into the scene with the bullies in the playground, the one that Thomas Dekker and Lindsay Hahn talked about in the documentary. And later on, the movie does include a shot of the children walking through the playground. That's supposed to take place right before this scene starts. And the original film has a scene like this one. However, this one is not so forgiving. They encounter 3 bullies, and they proclaim that they have to pay a toll to pass through. Mara starts to lead the other children around them and avoid the conflict altogether. But then the head bully jumps in front of her, shoving his palm in her face. The bully continues to taunt her, but she just coldly stares at him, to which he retaliates. What's the matter? Monkey got your tongue? The bully starts mocking her, sticking his tongue out, and starts dancing around her like a monkey. The children all focus on him as he dances around Mara. His friends are laughing hysterically until they realize the bully's unable to stop. The bully's face becomes tortured, and he starts whimpering and crying as he continues to dance around the children with his tongue out. The children pass them, but then Mara turns back and glares at him even harder, and the bully bites deeply into his own tongue, collapses to the ground, howling in pain. And here's another continuity difference. Right after the bully scene happens is where David separates himself to go to the cemetery to look for the missing baby, and the rest of the children continue on to the clinic. And if you go back to the film and you look really closely, you'll notice David isn't actually there with them. The scenes at the clinic and David at the cemetery are intertwined with each other. The encounter with Susan and the children happens in the hallway, and then it cuts to where David encounters Melanie at the cemetery. And as mentioned before, the cemetery is on top of a large bluff, and David watches Melanie drunkenly stumble over to the 200-foot cliff edge. It doesn't specify, but it leads me to believe that in this version, David sees her either fall over or jump over the cliff. After this, the script goes back to the scene where Lily is having her eye exam, and when Reverend George is talking to Susan, he sees Alan's car pull up. He leans in and whispers to Susan, "Look what happened to the doc's wife. They say he found her." And when Alan and Jill are talking, the conversation starts with Jill saying how sorry she is about what happened to Barbara. Alan responds, "Well, at least you have the courage to talk to me," then confides to Jill that he doesn't know what's worse, watching Barbara suffering from a pain that he couldn't cure, or the betrayal he feels for her leaving him to deal with this alone. Jill questions, betrayal? She made her choice. Let's just leave it at that. Thanks for asking. And then when Mara gets in the car, Susan approaches, pleading for him to come back to the project, but he just drives off without responding. And on his way home, he sees David walking alongside the road. In the very next scene in the script, Jill is in her kitchen putting groceries away, and she hears that same haunting melody being played on the piano. She walks into the living room, and it's David playing. As she enters the room, amazed at what she's seeing, David stops playing. He reads Jill's thoughts and responds, "I watched you," referring to the time when he was 4 months old. Jill asks to play along with him, to which David looks puzzled. She sits next to him and signals him to start, and she joins in playing the harmonizing part to the melody. David closes his eyes, tilts his head back, and loses himself in the melody. When they reach the end, David opens his eyes and offers Jill a smile. Jill smiles back with a faint sadness, and David responds, "It reminds you of him." The two continue playing again, and they're interrupted by Mara's voice off camera. "David!" Through the living room window, Mara and the other children glare at him from outside. David tells Jill he has to go as she begins to play again, and for a moment, David joins in again, but he quickly pulls his hands from the keys as if some unseen force is making him, and he yells again, "I have to go," and leaves. The next scene in the script is when Mara approaches Alan in a study, stating there are going to be changes, which in the film happens later on. And next in the script is where David and Jill have the conversation about emotions and empathy. And I have to point out that Jill still asks him if he wants to talk about what happened at the clinic, despite him not being there. Jill says goodnight and starts to leave. David remorsefully says, "No, wait," and Jill sits back down. He asks her what that song means. Jill explains that songs don't have to mean anything, but they're like feelings you can hear: happy, sad, longing, or even angry feelings, and that songs are like people like you and me. She leaves David pondering this, something he doesn't understand. The next scene in the script is where the children arrive at the army base where they were born. Again, in the film, it's a red barn, as the voice of Reverend George gives the eulogy to Melanie's funeral. We see the children line up in the same order they were placed in their cribs the night they were born, with a space for the missing child. In the first draft, the scene continues, and the children, just like the night they were born, turn their heads and look out the window to where the van was parked, the van where Susan brought the missing baby. David moves to the window and stares out, drawn to the distant memory. And the next scene in the script is where Alan meets David in the cemetery, and this scene was originally longer too, just as I predicted in our last video when I found this picture. My voice keeps cracking up. Jill hurries towards them, asking David where he's been. Alan tells David that his mother has
2 hours.
Alan tells David that his mother has someone here too, someone she lost who she loved very much, just like them. David reads Alan's mind and says, "No, he's not my father." Jill immediately grabs him, telling him that Frank is his father, to which David coldly responds, "No." Jill grabs him harder, yelling at him that Frank is his father and to never say that he's not ever again. Alan puts his hand on her shoulder. She releases David, and he slowly walks away from them. Jill is crying, and Alan puts his arms around her, and for a moment they hold each other. Alan tells Jill that he will try to teach them, and then he looks down at Barbara's grave and tells Jill that he has to get on with living, and feels he can possibly help after this encounter with David. And that's a wrap for now. Stay tuned for part 3. So, I tracked these scripts down. This film was better at one point. Universal took the project over and cut out many important scenes. I don't know why to make it shorter. Just leave the damn story in there. And the next scene is good old Carlton, Buck Flower. We see the children walk past the janitor closet just like in the movie, and then next Alan is in the classroom with them. However, in this script, the scene takes place in the school library. Peter Jason says in the Blu-ray documentary that finding filming locations was a challenge. So I'm guessing this scene and switching the army base to the red barn were compromises as a result of this. And because of the location switch, the scene with Carlton plays out quite differently. Jill calls Alan over the intercom to come see her. He leaves, and Carlton enters the room, delivering the line, "I know your game. I know what you're up to." The script then cuts to Alan and Jill in her office, which we see earlier in the film, only the conversation is a little bit different. Alan tells her that David must have been told about the Roberts baby, and that there's no way he could possibly have a memory of that night. Jill asks him, "Why would David say Frank isn't his father?" And Alan responds, "Sometimes I wonder if I'm Mara's." And the script cuts back to Carlton saying, "Ever since you got here, I've been watching." The scene with Carlton plays out like the movie, jabbing his broomstick at Robert, whacking him in the head. The big difference with the location is the library is on the second floor. Carlton backs up to an open window and falls backwards, landing on a parked car below, impaling himself with the broomstick. Alan and Jill rush out to the scene, and then Alan rushes up to the library. All the children have left. He goes over to the open window and sees the aftermath of Carlton's body on the car below, with a frantic crowd gathering around. He then looks in the distance and sees the children calmly walking away in formation. Later that night, Callie is over at Jill's house comforting her, telling her not to go into work tomorrow. Jill says that she'll be okay, and that they all knew Carlton had a drinking problem, to which Callie responds, "What if it wasn't an accident?" recalling what happened to Barbara and Melanie. David enters the room and claims Carlton had been drinking and fell out the window, and that he didn't feel anything about him. Jill tears up and asks, "Why not? I know you feel emotions. I know it!" Next is the scene with Alan and Susan at the clinic, and the script plays out like the movie until Alan meets up with Mara at the army base after Ben's death. Mara gives some extra dialogue as to why they do what they do, stating they have to protect themselves, and sooner or later, you'll try to destroy us. Alan says, "Yeah, if you continue to do this, people will hate you and take revenge." and Mara explains that you're strong by numbers, but mentally underdeveloped. We are mentally strong, but physically weak. And at the part where Alan looks back at David and tells Mara he's not so sure about them not being able to develop emotions, he also responds with, in some respects, you are my child. You developed inside a human mother and were born as a human is born. After this scene, Alan is spotted leaving through Reverend George's rifle scope, and David is also spotted walking outside to the place where Susan parked the van 7 years ago. Mara follows him outside, and once again the script plays out like the movie for a little while until we get to the scene where Susan is burning in the street. There's a small deleted scene of her falling over as her body continues to burn. And we're gonna jump even more ahead because both scripts actually play out just like the movie does, all the way up till the final showdown. The only real difference in the second draft is when Jill tries to get David out of the barn and he yells, "Mother, no!" Mara snaps at him saying, "Don't call her mother!" The first draft plays out quite a bit differently, however. The scene where Alan and Jill are at the school, he tells her that he's going out to the army base and wants her to come out later to pick David up. Take him away from here, far away, and hide. Don't ever let them find you. David can be saved. He's not completely one of them. Teach him love. Right now, he's lost under the influence of the others. And he tells Jill to pick him up at exactly 11:25. In the final scene, Alan asks Lily to go out to get the briefcase from his car. Mara intervenes and sends David instead. David brings the briefcase inside as Mara is interrogating him just like in the movie. But at one point, she tricks Alan. Her face softens up and he calls him, "Father?" Alan, stunned, pushes David back out the door and closes it without the children noticing. But for the first time, Alan looks at Mara like the daughter every father would want to have. Mara, soft-faced, calls him, "Daddy?" And Alan lets his guard down, and then instantly her face turns cold, eyes begin to glow, and she immediately starts drilling Alan's mind. Jill meets David outside, and the two embrace each other as the barn explodes. Right off the bat, the thing that was screwed up the most was Jill's character. I mean, one thing John Carpenter said that he wanted to do differently from the original film was tell this from the woman's perspective, and what it was like for a mother to raise one of these children. So when Universal started cutting things out, I don't know why to make it shorter, they cut out all of the meat of this character. As the film stands, Frank dies, Jill is sad, then she forgets it happened. What was the point of setting this up if you're not going to do anything with it? And as we see in the script, this bonds her, Alan, and David much closer. They're the trio that can all relate to each other because they've all lost someone. Like when Alan kisses Jill at the school right before he goes out to the barn. It actually has a deeper meaning knowing the whole story. And Alan is one of those characters that if you just left in 1 or 2 lines of dialogue that were in the script, it adds a whole other layer to this guy, speaking volumes to the amount of turmoil that he's in. Not only is he angry with Mara for being what she is, but he also resents his wife for leaving him alone to deal with the situation that he's in. And David, the scenes with him and Jill actually connecting with each other, showing more of him struggling to figure out, like, what are these feelings that I'm having? Like when he asked Jill what that melody they were playing on the piano means. I'm not saying every single little scene that was presented here needed to be included to tell the story, but damn, when he cut most of the character development out, it really does feel like the last half is just a race to get to the kills. And it isn't like there's a ton of them anyway, so I don't know. Just leave the damn story in there. And speaking of kills, not that it was a kill, but what's up with cutting out the scene with the bullies in the playground? Not that the film needed it, but seriously? I feel like that's one of those things where if people who've only seen it in the theaters many years ago remember one thing, it would be that. I mean, the only logical thing I can think of is it was 1995 when this came out. Maybe it took things too far at the time with child brutality. Come on, you want shock value? There it is. All right, I'm going to stop there. I think I've made my case again. This film was better at one point. Somewhere out there's got to be a work print VHS with all these scenes on it. That's my only hope for seeing any sort of director's cut of this. And if anyone has it, I don't even care if it's black and white. You leak that shit! Do it! And that's about it. Fans of the film, I hope I was able to bring a plethora of information to you because I know how hard it is to find anything out on the internet. Trust me, I've looked. But unfortunately, these scripts are probably the closest we're going to get to seeing the actual director's cut. I just don't see them putting any money into restoring the footage or John Carpenter cutting the film back to its original version, but who knows? Anyways, if you like this video, hit like and hit the subscribe button. It's free and it helps, and I'm done here.